are threatened. For the question of when should we use force, it's any time that our national interest is threatened. Specifically, what's on the voters' minds right now is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the staging area for 9/11. It definitely impacted our national security, and we definitely had to respond with force. My opponent has said that he supports a random time withdrawal. I do not support that. He says that it's because he thinks that creating stability over there is unrealistic. Well, that's what his party said about Iraq. And because we were consistent and persistent and supported our men and women who are serving over there and risking their lives, we have seen stability and we have created a more safe environment. I think that if we randomly withdraw out of Iraq, Afghanistan right now, we're simply going to embolden the terrorists to come after us even harder because we have not seen the benchmarks that need to be in place in Afghanistan before we leave.
All right, very good. Mr. Coons, anything further?
Ms. O'Donnell, would you just, one more time for us, lay out what those benchmarks are for success in Afghanistan?
Absolutely. We need to see a representative government that serves the needs of the people and that is able to defend itself. We were working in Afghanistan to defeat the Soviets in the 80s, and we left without seeing these things created. And that's why Afghanistan became a vacuum for terrorism and a staging ground for 9/11. We cannot leave without finishing what we started. It happened when we left without finishing the job in the 80s, and we paid a price on 9/11. We cannot do that. You can stand there and politically correct, rubber stamp the foreign policy agenda coming from your party, but that does not do a service to the people here in Delaware who are concerned about their security, who are concerned about their safety. We need to support our troops. We need to strengthen our military. Our military has to be feared once again by rogue nations and terrorists. They need to know that we are serious about defending our people, about defending our homeland, and that the threat of military action actually means something again. If we allow these terrorists to chase us out of Afghanistan like you want to do, you're putting every single person here in this room at risk. How dare you give into political correctness like that?
Ms. O'Donnell, that makes a great speech. It's a nice slogan, but there's no substance behind it whatsoever. I would take you far more seriously if I had ever seen you at a deployment ceremony for the Delaware National Guard, at a homecoming ceremony.
Well, unlike you, I don't turn these things into photo ops.
Ms. O'Donnell,
I support our troops, I support our military, and I do not do it for the glory of a campaign trail.
Okay, let's have Mr. Coons respond before we move on to another question.
Ms. O'Donnell, you have just laid out a position on Afghanistan that is reckless and irresponsible.
It is reckless and irresponsible to pull out before the job is done and our people are safe.
How many
years? It is putting the lives at it is making a mockery of those who are putting their lives at risk
out of Afghanistan. Because frankly, the men and women of our armed forces, the men and women of Delaware, who have served and continue to serve honorably a decade in Afghanistan, have no clear end in sight if the objectives and goals are as you stated. Iraq
and that's what then Senator Barack Obama said about Iraq. But because men and women willingly re-enlisted specifically to go over there.
Anything like the infrastructure of a modern nation, and despite our best efforts, hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of lives, we have not succeeded in Afghanistan.
So you're saying that we should continue to use the Afghan people at our interest and not help them.
So Ms. O'Donnell, I think what you're doing is simply yelling empty rhetoric rather than laying out responsible objectives for our armed forces overseas.
So you're saying it was okay? So you're saying...
One moment, please, candidates.
Is not responsible.
So you're saying
One moment, please. One moment, please.
I don't think we answered Alan's question. And I want to back up just a second. I think when the War Powers Act was conceived, we were going to war with nations.
Right.
I don't know if it's been invoked or not invoked in the case of going to war against Al-Qaeda, if we can formally call it a war. But if the commander-in-chief can authorize military force like that, could they do the same, in your opinion, of someone like a Mexican drug lord?
Well, what we're going after right now, as we were talking about in Afghanistan, is the war on terror. Many nations have been used as safe havens for terrorists, so it's difficult to actually identify one nation. So when we use force, it is where a specific nation has put our national interest at jeopardy. So in this particular battle for our security, it's difficult to declare which nation it would be that we are in war with. But to get back to Afghanistan, I mean, I need to ask my opponent
Mr. Nardone,
if
to
he
answer your
thinks it was
question,
right.
there was a specific congressional authorization of the use of force against terrorists. And because of the novel type and structure of the threat we face today, I think that was an appropriate congressional act because we're not fighting against the structured army of an existing nation. The challenge, as our exchange just highlights, is that in the state of Afghanistan, there is no modern nation state, and there hasn't been for decades. And as then President Bush said in his candidacy, the United States has a real challenge. If what we're going to take on is nation building rather than fighting terrorists to make our country more safe, we are engaged in a decades-long effort in Afghanistan. I don't think that's in the best interest of this country.
So are you saying what we did?
I think we should be fighting terrorists, not trying to build a modern nation.
Okay, so let me clarify. When we, through covert operations, supplied the people of Afghanistan with weapons to fight the Soviet Union because we were in a Cold War, the Soviet Union was one of our weapons, or one of our enemies, you are saying it was okay to do what we did. Do you know what we did then? I mean, it was, so you're saying it's okay.
I'd be
Was
happy
that
to have
okay?
you join the panel if you'd like.
My
might help
question
you
is to
focus
you,
your
Chris.
question.
My question is
I
to you.
support Ms.
Was
O'Donnell.
it okay what we did after
Your
supplying
question doesn't
covert?
make sense, Ms. O'Donnell.
If you know what's going on in
Ms.
Afghanistan, my
O'Donnell,
question
you thought
makes
we were
perfect
fighting the
sense.
Soviets in the 90s the last time we faced each other. I'm not sure you're clear what decade this
No,
happened
that's
in.
not true.
Yes.
Do you, Mr. Coons,
Can I jump in?
is it okay?
Please.
It'd be
to
great
do-
if the panel would ask the question.
If you'll
Coons and Mr.
notice, he
Donald.
does not answer
One
the
second.
difficult questions.
Quite honestly, nobody's
Of
answered
course
my
I
colleague's
supported
question
our
yet, so let me
actions against the
redefine it and
Soviets.
put it out there again. I think really what he was asking is, we now have a new template. If you're not fighting a nation, you're fighting an organization. Can this spread? Can we turn to Mexico and say, this poor boater who was shot right there on the coast, we're coming in after that person. Where are the borders of this new policy, given how we have prosecuted this war against the Taliban and al-Qaeda?
Yeah, I think we both did answer that question in terms of the power lies in the Congress, and the Congress votes on whether or not that active force is to protect our national interests. So I think we are actually in agreement in that, because the threats to our nation have become so random in terms of it's not a specific nation. The terrorists aren't acting on behalf of a specific nation. Now, if you said a boater, if that was an act of aggression that they did on behalf of Mexico, and we can prove that they were charged with this on behalf of Mexico, then that might be a situation where the president can declare war. But if there's I'm not saying the president should declare war on the boater. I mean, I just want to clarify that. I'm saying when these groups act on behalf of a government that represents a country that has acted as a hostile act towards us.
In the interest of time, Mr. Coons, let's get a final remark from you on this, and then we're going to move on, because we have closing arguments coming up in about 10 or 12 minutes.
There is a critical, ongoing congressional oversight role in making sure that in this modern environment where we are fighting less against nation states and more against loosely affiliated terrorist groups around the world, to make sure that we do so in a way that protects us as a nation and a people against terrorist attack, but also respects our most fundamental rights. And where I think the previous administration and those in Congress of both parties got off track was in failing to exercise sufficient oversight to make sure that we didn't get outside the boundaries of our core values. When we conduct ourselves in war in a way that violates our international commitments or that violates our most basic principles as a nation, we give help to terrorists who would discredit us as a country. I think we need to fight harder than ever for the core values and the basic rights of this nation. I will strongly support our armed forces, and I'll support the President in his commander-in-chief role of whichever party, but I will hold him accountable, him or her accountable, for conducting our foreign affairs in the future in a way that respects our most fundamental rights, because in my view, that ultimately is what will make us most safe as a country and will most help us have the strong multilateral relationships around the world, a network of allies in the war on terror with us that we need to sustain in order to be successful in the long term.
Ms. O'Donnell, last month your campaign opened a campaign office here in Brandy 100. Is your campaign still paying a portion of the rent of your townhome in Greenville for a campaign office?
60 seconds.
Yeah, we still use that as an office, and our staff still lives there. Your newspaper grossly mischaracterized what those campaign funds are being used for, as have my opponent's ads. We house many of our staffers who come from downstate because they work long hours, and those funds are used to pay for that housing. We run our office out of the townhouses in Greenville, and we have a main headquarters in which our volunteers come to stuff envelopes, do phone banking, and everyone's welcome to come visit it.
Okay, Mr. Coons, as county executive or in your time on county council, did you ever eliminate or vote to get rid of a tax exemption for seniors, as your opponent alleges?
In my current role as county executive, we asked for a financial future task force to review all the different tax exemptions and all the different sources of revenue and expenses in county government. One of the recommendations they made was that we apply a residency requirement, because thousands of seniors had retired to Newcastle County and were taking advantage of a tax exemption that had been expanded as the very last act of my predecessor. We did not advance that proposal. Councilman Smiley did the next year, and a majority of council voted for it, and I signed it into law. So what it imposed was, on those seniors who are earning less than $50,000 a year, it decreased the amount of the home value that they could exempt from property tax and imposed a residency requirement, if I remember correctly. It's a complicated matter. The punchline is, in trying to resolve our financial challenges as a county, I asked an independent board of folks from the Chamber of Commerce to organized labor, people with previous public sector experience and private sector experience, to look at all the different programs in Newcastle County that were either raising revenue or costing us money. They made a specific recommendation to ensure that the senior property tax exemption was targeted at those who needed it, and amendments were later made to that program to reduce its cost in terms of the county and to ensure that those who were low income still were able to benefit from the exemption.
Mark Nardone from Delaware Today.
Are we allowed to respond or comment, crosstalk?
We can. I question how constructive it will be in this particular approach, and I would like to get in one more question before we go to closing argument. So if it's okay with you.
Two more time. Let's go to two.
On CNN last week, Mr. Coons, you cited air quality as our biggest environmental problem. And Ms. O'Donnell, you cited the need for regulatory reform. Can you just amplify your positions on that a bit, please?
Mark, who answered your question first last time? Do you remember?
I'll answer. I don't mind.